Oh, hello. That's better. Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you to Europa, Nostra, Finland for the invitation for this event, but also to be one of the co-editors of this lovely publication that's come out today. And congratulations again to all the authors. It's a really nice thing to have been involved with and then to see develop. So it's really, really good. Thank you. I have to apologise as well because of the nature of this event. I'm inevitably going to go over ground that colleagues have already mentioned and that people will mention later on in the next presentations and in the discussion most likely. And I'm also very aware, looking at the audience and the people I recognise here, that we're all very much preaching to the converted in a way. We all understand that participation does matter and it's vital to cultural heritage. What I'd like to do in my presentation is draw on a little bit on current research, not just my own but others. So I'll present some of the literature which really sort of tries to theorise but also advocate for community participation in heritage, especially around these often quoted ideas of bottom-up and top-down. And what I hope to show is that it's never a straightforward process, but it's always a worthwhile process. I'll draw a little bit on my own recent research too. Some of this is already published, some of it is in preparation, so if you're very interested, you can find out more later about that, if it gets accepted by the journal, of course. So, just to begin with, and thank you, Astrid, for already touching on this, but there are questions around what we actually mean when we talk about bottom-up and top-down. They're very often used terms. I should say as well, because of my background, I do draw a lot from community archaeology in particular, and the work that archaeologists have been doing really for many decades. I think the concept of public archaeology first emerges in the early 1970s, so that gives you an idea of how long that particular part of the heritage sector has been thinking about this, but I don't think that's particularly unusual. In the 1960s, town planners were talking about citizen power already. But just to quote one of my colleagues from Scotland, Kevin Grant, in simplistic terms, top-down approaches to community archaeology practice, and this goes to all heritage practice, I would argue, occurs when the programme of research, structure of the project and methodologies are imposed from outside onto an existing community, whereas bottom-up approaches are characterised more by a project originating in grassroots community activity. Again, that's something we've already been thinking about today, that we do have these sort of different types of projects that can either be imposed from outside, maybe as an effort to improve enthusiasm and citizen support for a certain kind of heritage. And there's also heritage, like with Malmö Airport, that's very much supported from the community itself and a real sort of grassroots ideal. We've already had Nina Simon mentioned today as well, and she's come up within the concept of the participatory museum in a very influential book that's really transformed the way we think about participation in museums, both in sort of real situations but also in the forms of digital participation. And one of the many models that she talks about is this idea of three kinds of participation, and she talks in the concept of museum work, but again, I think it's relevant in very many forms of heritage activism and practice. And in a way, they sort of mirror different stages of participation and involvement. So she says that in contributory projects, visitors are solicited to provide limited and specified objects, actions or ideas to an institutionally controlled process. Comment boards and story sharing kiosks are both common platforms for contributory activities. So this is an idea where people do participate, but it's very much controlled by the institution. The parameters are set, and sometimes that's entirely appropriate and that's the right way to do things, and it can sometimes be the only way to achieve a goal. People do need guidelines very often. The next kind that she talks about is collaborative projects, And she says here, visitors are invited to serve as active partners in the creation of institutional projects that are originated and ultimately controlled by the institution. So similar to contributory, but maybe with a higher level of participation, that visitors are actually creating and not just reacting to the project in hand. Finally, she talks about the co-creative projects, and she says that here community members work together with institutional staff members from the beginning to define the project's goals and to generate the program or exhibit based on community interests. So this really mirrors in a way Kevin Grant's description of bottom-up and grassroots work. The professional organisation is still involved, but the idea and the impetus is very much coming from the community. Again, these are all different kinds of models, and they're not necessarily better or worse than each other, but they are appropriate maybe in different situations and contexts. To think about this idea also of community ownership, we all know about the idea that people have a stake in heritage, that people feel different levels of ownership on different kinds of heritage, and that different types of heritage also matter to different groups. So the official heritage being celebrated by the authorities might be quite different to what matters to communities. And again, in the discussion before coffee, we talked a little bit about how policy and law doesn't always keep up to pace with current theory and current ideas with regards to participation. Sometimes the law does catch up though, and this is a project I've been working on since last summer in Scotland. This was thanks to a research grant from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I was able to go and spend several months in Glasgow and in Perthshire in central Scotland, which was very nice. It was the summer, and the sun actually shone a little bit too, which was especially nice, so thank you Scotland for that. But in the case of Scotland, it's quite interesting with regards to the idea of community ownership and community empowerment with regards to heritage, because in Scotland there actually is a law for owning, literally owning your own heritage. This is the Land Reform Act 2003, which has recently been updated and complemented by, since 2000, and I'm really sad this is being filmed because I'm going to say the wrong year. It's either 2015 or 2016, the Community Empowerment Act. But what this means is, because Scotland has quite a long and fairly, one would argue, or could argue, negative tradition of very few landowners actually owning most of the territories of Scotland, this act was brought in as part of the devolution. So in the United Kingdom, when Scotland and Wales got their own parliaments, they were looking at ways to also create their own power, decentralised away from the House of Parliament in Westminster. And one of the areas in the Scottish jurisdiction where control was very possible was in the issue of land ownership, and so it was seen as an opportunity to try to redress the balance against the tradition of wealthy landowners and tenants with maybe less control over the places where they live. And there have been many examples, many cases of community, they're called community buyouts, where the local community is actually bought and takes complete managerial responsibility for their territory or their land. And the case study I was very interested in and worked with colleagues from the Centre for Battlefield Archaeology at the University of Glasgow was a place called Cultibragan in Comrie in Perthshire. Cultibragan is quite an interesting site. It is a heritage site, but some would argue maybe a difficult heritage for some. And this is an interesting question too. What happens when the heritage in question is actually uncomfortable or difficult for some people? Cultibragan is very important in terms of conflict heritage and 20th century conflict history. It's the best preserved prisoner of war camp in Scotland and probably in the whole of the UK. During the Second World War, it was used to keep Axis troops, first Italians and then later Germans. And it was, as you can see on the map, because of its central position, it was strategically important because it was considered much harder to escape. You'd have to go a long way to get to the nearest U-boat. And so because of that, Culti along with one other prisoner of war camp in Scotland, was what was classed as a hardcore camp for hardcore Nazis. So the people who were captured from from campaigns involving the German army, if they were considered to be particularly hardcore in their Nazi ideology beliefs, they were sent to Culti. And so it's not just a POW camp, it's actually a POW camp where we know the bad guys in history were kept. Because of that, many of the locals actually feel very uncomfortable with the site. They don't like the idea of celebrating this aspect of history. They're uncomfortable with the fact that Waffen-SS and Kriegsmarine and all these characters were in their neighbourhood. On the other hand, the camp was also used after the war as a training area for the Ministry of Defence, and so you also have many generations of British men who've been through the army or been through cadet training while at school, who've actually been to camp in Culti and have actually quite fond memories of the place. There are also people who are, of course, fascinated by World War II history, even people with family connections. Some of the German soldiers came back to Scotland and started families, and their children, now elderly themselves, are very passionate about preserving this site as a piece of their own family history. Well, that's the sort of heritage history of the site. Along came the Land Reform Act, and in 2007, Culti and some hill area around it was actually purchased by the village as a community buyout, and it is managed by Comrie Development Trust, which is a board of trustees made up of local residents. Sounds great, really, and in many ways it is, and it's an interesting site because they use it for environmental education as well as heritage education. However, in practice, as I learnt when I spent several weeks there interviewing different residents and other stakeholders, it's actually very problematic. Not only do you have this difficult heritage which divides opinions very much within the community, you also have an issue that the community has been given a site which has quite important interpretation issues, but also crucial conservation needs, which they're not necessarily equipped to deal with. And many people who've served on the committee have left the committee very quickly, and the word burnout came up many times in the interviews that I had there. And I just wanted to quote Ben Kisby, a political researcher, who I think this example, certainly within the UK context, fits into a bigger sort of political ideology that was around, particularly under the coalition and then the Conservative governments, of big society where communities would take control and look after places themselves. If you want a library, fine, you staff it yourself. Unfortunately, though, as Kisby's pointed out, at the very worst, this is dangerous as a genuine belief that charities and volunteers, rather than the state, can and should provide numerous core public services. And so many people that I interviewed felt that actually the government had been doing a disservice to them by making them look after this site. Why can't it be looked after by the professionals instead, who know what they're doing, who actually get paid to do this kind of thing? So I think this is a really interesting example, because whilst on the surface it looks like the ideal of complete community empowerment, actually it's created quite a burden for the local community, and many people really don't know about the future and don't feel confident that in 10 years' time there will still be a Culti heritage site owned by the local village. On to another model, and this is one again that's been mentioned earlier as an award winner from Europa Nostra, and also you'll find in a new publication a whole chapter about this, so please read. This is the Adopter Monument run by Pirkanmaa Provincial Museum in Tampere, and I think this is a really nice example because there is a lot of empowerment involved in this. As they often acknowledge themselves, it's inspired by the Adopter Monument scheme in Scotland, but I think the Finnish version takes it even a step further in terms of how people adopt the sites, and teams of volunteers can come forward, and these groups are everything from schools through to Rotary clubs, through to just groups of friends that want to have an interesting project to take on. And they have a certain degree of independence, and they really do take on the stewardship responsibilities in partnership and in consultation with the museum service and also with landowners and other stakeholders. But at the same time, they have complete support through training and other advice from the museum service. So I think it's a really nice blend of community empowerment without taking away that sort of specialist responsibility to make sure that people really do feel confident and feel there is somebody they can turn to and have support for this. So I think that's maybe a more successful model in a way. Models like the community buyout that I mentioned earlier, in a way it's still early days, maybe we'll find that they do work in the future. So this really brings me on to another concept borrowed from community archaeology, which I think is really, really useful for thinking about collaboration. It's from North America, and it's been used very much in research involving traditional owner communities, so Native Americans, First Nations in Canada, and so on. And this was put forward by Chip Colwell-Chanthavon and T.J. Ferguson, and they call it the collaborative continuum. And just a quote from their article about this, they say that collaboration in practice does exist on a continuum, from merely communicating research to descendant communities to a genuine synergy where the contributions of community members and scholars create a positive result that could not be achieved without joining efforts. Collaboration, then, is not one uniform idea or practice, but a range of strategies that seek to link the archaeological, in this case, enterprise with different publics by working together. And I think this idea of a continuum, although I was asked to talk about top-down and bottom-up, is actually a more useful way of thinking about how communities and heritage professionals and others work together. That it really is a case that it isn't one size fits all. In some cases, communities will be able to have a lot more control over what they're doing, perhaps after having gone through several stages of more top-down training and support going through to greater empowerment later on. In other cases, it's entirely appropriate for the organisation, for the professionals to come in, and an example that immediately springs to mind from England, again, is the example of Dig Manchester, which was a several-year project across the whole of the city of Manchester, a city which has a lot of areas of social deprivation. And the idea was to use council-owned land, so usually parkland, but other areas too, to instigate excavations and other archaeological interventions involving local communities. This had to be top-down because many of these communities had gone through several generations of unemployment. There were literacy issues and other challenges socially. And I think it's fair to say that many of the participants would never have dreamt of doing something like that had they not been actively encouraged. But at the same time, the results were incredibly powerful. One of the local councillors who followed this very closely has done an analysis that crime levels actually dropped during the times that the excavations were on. Maybe a coincidence, but maybe not. So different levels of collaboration and different sort of positions along the continuum are entirely appropriate depending on the situation. And I think, as I've said already, it isn't the case that it's always the same kind of model that's going to be successful. I think it's important to learn from each other and to look at successful examples, as are in the publication, but to remember that it really isn't one size fits all, and often you have to try several models perhaps to see the one that's going to work best for what you'd like to do. So in terms of conclusions, I don't really have any, to be honest. I'm hoping there'll be some more discussion later on. I hope I've been able to present a couple of ideas and a couple of examples. This last photo is actually from another public archaeology project I've been involved with in Finnish Lapland as part of Lapland's Dark Heritage project. Again, looking at supposedly difficult heritage connected to the Second World War and how different stakeholders feel about that. But also, we hope, as the participant researchers in the project, we also hope it's been something that's engendered a lot more interest about the project, that's empowered people. We already know that people who volunteered on the excavation have formed their own friendships now. They have their own Facebook group. they go out together and explore the World War II heritage in the region. And so I think really, again, given who I'm talking to, we all just need to keep doing what we're doing. I have my references from this, but I guess we'll probably share the slides, so if anybody needs to look at those or would like to, or just come and talk to me afterwards. Thank you.